The torches had been burning since the second bell. Deep inside Iron Moon Keep, the great obsidian doors of the Alpha's war chamber were sealed against the cold, but not fully, not quite. A thin blade of firelight bled beneath them, cutting across the stone corridor floor like a wound the dark could not swallow. And through that same narrow gap, voices carried, low voices, the kind that men use when they believe the hall belongs only to them. Geraldine Delk was 4 steps from that door. She was not supposed to be standing in a cold corridor at this hour. She was supposed to be in the guest chambers they had given her, the ones with the carved wolf above the hearth and the heavy wool drapes that smelled of pine smoke and something older, something she could not name. She was supposed to be resting, composing herself, being the kind of quiet and graceful betrothed that the Northern Dominion had always expected an Omega daughter to be. But care, real care, the stubborn, unhurried, wordless kind, does not always follow schedules. She was carrying a small clay vessel, warm against her palms. Inside it was a healing compress she had spent the better part of the evening preparing. Silver root, ground fine, cold moss soaked in water drawn from the keep's eastern spring, where the moonlight touched the surface longest, and 1 drop, just 1, of her own healer's essence, pressed from her fingertip and stirred in with slow, deliberate intention. Because her essence would work deeper than any compound she could mix alone. It would ease the tension she had noticed at the base of Xavier's jaw since the morning's border reports arrived, the tightness he carried there, that he believed no one saw. She had done this quietly, no announcement, no waiting to be asked. She had done it because the evening before, standing in the courtyard while the first snow of the season came down in long, lazy curtains, he had reached across the space between them and settled his cloak more firmly around her shoulders. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony, just adjusted it, the way you adjust something that matters, without needing to explain why. His silver eyes had not even met hers when he did it, as though it required no performance, as though it were simply correct. She had replayed that gesture 11 times between then and now. She had built a small, careful world around it, one that felt, for the first time in years, like it might hold. She was 4 steps from the door when his voice reached her. "She has settled well enough into the keep?" Xavier's, but not the voice he used with her, not the measured, low warmth she had catalogued and turned over in private. This was a different register entirely, stripped of every careful courtesy, flat as iron left in the cold, the voice of a man among his own, from whom he required nothing. The Omega girl, yes. A second voice, Bracknor Warfang. She recognized the lazy, rolling quality of it, the way he spoke as though everything faintly amused him. She looks at you as though you are something worth looking at. Xavier's response came without pause. Good. A grateful mate causes fewer complications than a watchful one. Geraldine did not move. The lunar bloodline is more concentrated than the seers projected. Xavier continued. She heard the sound of something heavy set down on stone, a cup perhaps, or the hilt of a blade. The binding ceremony cannot be a simple marking. Bracknor, you understand what the ritual requires. I understand what you're saying it requires. Bracknor's voice had shifted, just slightly. There is a difference. Do not philosophize at me. Cold, final. The ritual requires a sacrifice. The girl is simply the vessel for the power I need to claim this throne forever. Her lunar bloodline, released at the altar under the blood moon, will flow into the keep's foundation stones and lock the dominion to me. Every pack in the north will answer to no one else, not in my lifetime, not in any lifetime after. A third voice, rougher, younger, Thexa Darkpelt, whose laugh Geraldine had already recognized in the great hall. And the girl herself? Xavier did not answer that question. He did not need to. The silence was its own answer, and it was complete. Outside the door, Geraldine stood perfectly still. The clay vessel in her hands felt suddenly, impossibly heavy. The compress she had made, the one with her own essence stirred in because she had wanted him to be well, simply because she had wanted him to not carry that jaw tension alone into sleep, pressed warm against her palms like something she could not explain and could not take back. She looked at it. She thought about the cloak in the courtyard, the 11 replays, the small, careful world she had built from a single unhurried gesture in a snow-filled evening. She set the clay vessel down, very quietly, against the cold stone wall. When she straightened, something behind her eyes went entirely still. Not broken, not collapsing into grief or rage or the breathless animal panic that the moment deserved. Still, the way water goes still just before it freezes, the way a forest goes silent before the storm arrives, and every creature that knows how to survive has already moved. Geraldine Delk turned and walked back into the dark of the corridor. She left the healing compress exactly where she had set it. She left every last illusion she had carried into this kingdom in the same place. He wanted a vessel. He was going to learn what a lunar bloodline could do when the vessel decided it was done being still. This is only the beginning. Subscribe to follow Geraldine's full story and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to say hello to you personally, because the further this story travels, the more I need to know just how far our world has reached. The morning Xavier Branham rode into the valley of Delk, the fog had not yet lifted from the lower fields. Geraldine heard the horses before she saw them. She was standing at the window of her father's study, the one that faced the mountain road, her hands wrapped around a clay mug that had long gone cold. She had been awake since the 4th bell. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the particular breathless alertness of someone who has spent years waiting for a thing and cannot quite believe the waiting is finally over. The valley was dying. She had known it for 2 winters now, even if her father had refused to say it plainly. The soil along the lower terraces had gone pale and thin. The river ran slower each season. 3 families had already moved east toward the lowland settlements, loading their carts quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes as they went. The healers, what remained of them, could treat symptoms but not the cause. And the cause was simple and terrible. The Delk bloodline had always been the valley's anchor, and the Delk line was nearly spent. Her father was ill. Her 2 brothers were gone. There was only Geraldine, and Geraldine alone could not hold a dying valley and also hold everything else. The treaty had been her father's idea. The marriage had been the price of it. She had agreed without hesitation. That was the part she would later find difficult to explain. Not that she had agreed, but how quickly, how cleanly. As though some part of her had already made the calculation long before her father laid the parchment on the table. She set down the cold mug and went to dress. Xavier Branham was taller than the reports had suggested. He stood in the courtyard of her father's house with the easy, absolute stillness of a man who had never in his life needed to fill a silence with movement. He wore fur-lined riding leathers, dark as pitch, and a cloak the color of deep winter shadow that moved in the valley wind with a weight that seemed deliberate. His jaw was set. His silver eyes moved across the courtyard with the calm, unhurried assessment of someone taking inventory. The crumbling eastern wall, the frost-killed herb beds along the south fence, the way the house itself seemed to lean slightly, as old things lean when they are tired. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at her. Geraldine had dressed carefully, green wool, her best, hair pinned back the way her mother had taught her, with the small silver clasp that had belonged to her grandmother. She was not tall. She was not the kind of woman a room rearranged itself around, but she had learned a long time ago to stand as though she were. She crossed the courtyard and offered her hand. He took it. His grip was brief and firm, and his eyes did not leave her face. "Geraldine Delk," he said, not a question. "Alpha Branham." She kept her voice level. "Welcome to the valley." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, perhaps. "It needs work," he said, and it was so blunt and so plainly true that she almost laughed. "It needs a great deal of work," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded once, as though she had passed some private assessment she had not known she was sitting. Behind him, his lieutenant, a broad, dark-eyed man with a slow, lazy quality to his attention, caught her gaze briefly and glanced away. Bracknor Warfang. She had heard the name. She filed his face away carefully. The negotiations took 2 days. The treaty was signed on the 3rd morning. By the 4th afternoon, the riders were ready. Her father held both her hands in the doorway and looked at her for a long time without speaking. He had the eyes of a man trying to memorize something he knows he will not see again. "He is powerful," her father said finally, "but power is not character. Watch carefully." "I will," she said. She believed at that moment that watchfulness was the precaution of the cautious and not the armor of the endangered. She believed that the treaty was real, that the marriage was real, that the careful, assessing look Xavier had given her in the courtyard was the beginning of something. She rode north carrying hope like a lit candle in both hands, doing everything possible not to let the wind get at it. The trees changed before they reached the keep. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might dismiss if you were not a healer, if you did not have the particular attentiveness that years of reading living things had built into her nature. The birches along the northern road had a grayness to their bark that was not the ordinary gray of winter. It was deeper than that, the kind of gray that didn't come from cold, but from something being drawn out of the wood itself, slowly, over a long time. She pressed her palm against the trunk of one as they passed, and felt it, a faint, wrong resonance, like a bell that had been struck and then muffled before it could finish ringing. She said nothing. She kept riding. But she began to count. The gray trees, the patches of ground where the frost lay too thick and too permanent for the season, the places where the undergrowth had simply stopped. By the time Iron Moon Keep rose on the ridge ahead of them, black and massive against the iron sky, she had counted enough to know that whatever was wrong with this territory, it had been wrong for a long time. The wolves at the gate were the second sign. They were not the domesticated sentinels she had expected. They moved with a tight, coiled agitation, amber eyes too bright, hackles not fully settled even when the riders passed unchallenged. One snapped at the air beside her horse's flank for no reason she could see, and the handler yanked it back with a roughness that suggested this was not the first time. Inside the keep, Geraldine was shown to chambers on the upper eastern corridor. Stone floors, stone walls, a hearth that had been recently lit but still smelled of long disuse. The wool hangings were dark and heavy. The window looked out over the inner courtyard, where 2 wolves were circling each other in a way that had nothing playful in it. She unpacked her healer's kit before she unpacked anything else. She started with the wolves, because she couldn't start with the land until she understood what was happening to the land's creatures. She did not ask permission. This was, she understood, either bold or naive, and she had decided not to spend time determining which. She went to the kennels on the second morning, told the handler she was the Alpha's betrothed and had healing knowledge, and asked to examine the animals. The handler looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man calculating risk, and then stepped aside. What she found in the wolves was a depletion she recognized from her valley's last bad winter, but concentrated and strange, as though something were pulling continuously from the reserves they should have been able to restore through rest and food. She spent 3 hours in the kennels. She left a compound of ground root and pressed moonflower with the handler and told him how to administer it. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the wolves were calmer. No one commented on this directly, but she noticed the way the handlers looked at her when she passed, and the way that look was different from the first day.
Not warmer, exactly, more careful. Fexa Darkpelt, Xavier's youngest lieutenant, a woman with a sharp laugh and sharper eyes, stopped her in the inner corridor on the fourth morning and looked at her up and down the way you look at something you had not yet decided to take seriously. Omega healer playing at territory management, she said, not hostile, somewhere between amused and assessing. Bold. The wolves were suffering, Geraldine said simply. I have the knowledge to help. It seemed wasteful not to use it. Fexa looked at her for another moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she nodded once, as though she had passed some private assessment she had not known she was sitting.
Geraldine went back to her work. She catalogued what she could reach: the kitchen herb stores, the eastern water source, the state of the stones in the lower courtyard where the frost had cracked the mortar in patterns that told her something about what was moving through the ground beneath. She wrote everything in the small leather journal she kept in her healer's kit. She wrote in the notation her mother had taught her, the old Delk shorthand that no one outside her family could read. She was not yet frightened. She was attentive. There is a difference, and she understood both. On the 9th evening, it snowed. Not the thin, provisional snow of early season, but a real snowfall, deep and deliberate, the kind that comes in off the northern range and settles in for the night like it has made a decision. The courtyard below her window went white and quiet. The torches along the walls were the only color in it, amber points against all that clean dark. She was at the window when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the heavy, purposeful stride of the guards, and not the quick, light step of the house staff. Something in between, measured, self-possessed. Xavier knocked on the open doorframe. He was not in his formal leathers. A simpler tunic, dark, no cloak. He looked, in this stripped-back version, more like a person and less like a title, and she was not entirely sure that was less dangerous. "You are awake," he said. "I sleep poorly in new places," she answered. He looked at the window, then at the courtyard below, then at her. "Come," he said. "There is something you should see." She followed him, down the eastern stairs, through the lower corridor that smelled of old stone and pine resin, and out through the side door into the courtyard. The snow was still coming down, slow and thick and soundless. The torches hissed softly where flakes reached them. He stopped in the center of the courtyard and turned to look up. She looked up with him. Above the keep's eastern tower, through a gap in the cloud cover that the snowfall had not yet closed, the moon hung enormous and low, nearly full, its light doing something particular and beautiful to the fresh snow, turning everything below it into a landscape that did not quite belong to the ordinary world. She did not realize she had made a sound until he looked at her. "My mother used to bring me out on nights like this," he said. His voice was different out here, quieter. The keep's stone walls had a way of absorbing the performance that rank required and leaving something plainer behind. "She would have found you interesting," he said. She glanced at him. He was not looking at her. His eyes were still on the gap in the clouds, on the moon going slowly pale as the snow began to close over it. But there was something in the set of his jaw that was different from the courtyard of her father's house, different from the great hall at meals, different from every careful public version of him she had catalogued since arriving. He reached out then, not dramatically, not with any announcement, and settled the collar of her outer cloak where the wind had turned it back, straightening it with 2 fingers, the way you straighten something that is simply in need of being right. He did not look at her when he did it, as though it required no ceremony, as though it were simply the correct thing. She looked at his profile against the snow and felt the small, careful world she had been quietly, privately building take on a solidity she had not dared give it yet. She replayed that gesture 11 times before she slept. She was carrying the compress on the 12th night when she heard his voice through the door. She had made it carefully. Silver root, cold moss, 1 drop of her own essence, stirred in with slow, deliberate intention. The jar was warm against her palms, A good, clean warmth. The warmth of something that had been made with attention and care and the specific, quiet intention of wanting another person to be well. She had not announced her intention to bring it. She had simply made it, the way her mother had taught her. Care expressed through small and certain things when it could not yet move through words. She was 4 steps from the war chamber door when his voice came through the gap in the iron. Low, flat, stripped of the courtyard, stripped of the snow and the moon and the collar straightened without ceremony. The voice of a man among his own, from whom he required nothing, toward whom he owed nothing. The ritual requires a sacrifice. The girl is simply the vessel for the power I need to claim this throne forever. She did not move. Her lunar bloodline, released at the altar under the blood moon, will flow into the keep's foundation stones and lock the dominion to me. Bracknor's voice, then, flattened of its usual laziness. And the girl itself? Xavier did not answer. Fexa Darkpelt's rough, amused voice. She seems like the type to actually believe this is real. And still, Xavier did not answer. The silence was its own language, and she was fluent in it. Outside the door, Geraldine stood perfectly still. The compress pressed warm against her palms, the one with her own essence in it, because she had wanted him to be well, because of a collar straightened without looking, because of a mother who had brought him out into the snow to see the moon. She looked down at the clay jar. She set it down against the wall, very quietly, without any sound at all. When she straightened, something behind her eyes went entirely still. Not grief, not the collapsing, breathless thing she might have expected. Not rage, though the rage was there. A clean, cold flame of it banked low. Something older than any of those things. Something that her healer's training had never named, but she recognized the way you recognize a shift in the weather before the air has changed. In the quality of the silence, in the way the body knows. Still, the way water goes still just before it freezes. Geraldine Delk turned and walked back down the corridor. She left the compress where she had set it. She left the small, private world she had been building from a gesture in the snow in the same place, set down, gently, without breaking it, because she did not have the time for the luxury of breaking things. He had said the ritual. He had said the blood moon. She knew, without needing to count the days, that the blood moon was 9 nights from now. 9 nights. She did not panic. Panic was noise, and she needed silence. She went back to her chambers and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and thought with the same careful, methodical attention she brought to a complicated compound. What she had, what she needed, what the variables were, what she could not control and therefore would not waste thought on. She thought about the gray trees and the sick wolves and the sick territory sickness that had been blamed, in the whispered conversations of the house staff she had been quietly listening to since her second day, on some vague failure of the land's vitality. She thought about what she had felt when she pressed her palm to the birch trunk on the northern road. The wrong resonance, the muffled bell. She thought about what Lornix had said. The ancient wolf who lived in the lower cellars. She had met him accidentally on her 3rd night, following the sound of old stonework that she wanted to examine. He had been there in the dark, white-furred and enormous, and entirely still. And he had said nothing when she appeared, and also showed no intention of leaving. She had sat with him for a while in the particular silence of very old things, and at some point he had spoken without preamble, as old things do. The land does not need the blood of the healer. The land needs the healer to remain in it. She had not known what to do with that then. She did now.
She began the next morning, methodical, quiet, unannounced. She had already catalogued the keep's stores well enough to know what she could take without the absence being noticed for several days. Dried provisions, a water bladder, her healer's kit, the small leather journal with the Delk notation that no one else could read. She moved none of it yet. She only confirmed locations, measured distances in her memory, noted which guards changed at which hours and how long the gap was between the third bell watch and the fourth. The keep's foundations she had been studying since the third day, half from healer's instinct and half from the particular attentiveness her father had drilled into her from childhood. Know the bones of any place you enter. Know where the walls are thinnest. Know where the water moves underground. She had noted the old sealed passage in the eastern cellar, the one behind the broken wall panel that the house staff walked past without looking at, the way people walk past things they have decided are not their concern. She had not yet confirmed where it led. She needed to confirm where it led. She also needed to find Breknor Warfang and look at him carefully and determine whether what she thought she had heard in his voice, that brief, almost imperceptible flattening, the weight of a man who had asked a question he already found too heavy, was real or was only what she wanted it to be. Because if it was real, it mattered, and if it was not, she needed to proceed without him. She began to watch Breknor the way she watched the wolves, not with confrontation, not with anything obvious, but with the patient, recording attention of someone who understands that behavior over time tells the truth that words will not. She watched the way he positioned himself at the inner council meetings she could observe from the corridor above, slightly outside Xavier's immediate orbit, not quite at the table's edge, but not fully anchored to its center either. She watched the way he went quiet when Xavier spoke about the ceremony, not sullen, not afraid, quiet in the particular way of a man working out the arithmetic of something and not liking the sum. He was not her ally yet. He was a variable. She would treat him accordingly. On the fourth night after the corridor, she removed the first items from the stores, root provisions, wrapped in cloth and placed at the bottom of her healer's pack beneath the instruments. She moved through the lower corridor between the third and fourth bell with a candle that she kept her body in front of to minimize the light. She found the eastern passage and confirmed where it led. She returned to her chambers and updated the journal with a notation so small and compact that it would have taken a sharp eye and a knowledge of old Delk's script to read it as anything other than healer's shorthand. Then she sat at the window and looked at the moon, 3 nights fuller than it had been in the courtyard with Xavier, 3 nights closer to blood, and she let herself feel, just for a moment, everything she did not have the luxury of feeling during the day. She felt the ache of the cloak adjusted without looking. She felt the peculiar hollow grief of a thing that had been almost real and had turned out to be scaffolding over nothing. She felt the clean, cold anger of it, and underneath the anger something older and steadier, the deep, quiet certainty that she was still here, still thinking, still moving, and that these things were not nothing, that these things were, in fact, everything. Then she closed the window against the cold and went back to work. She had 5 nights left. She intended to use every one of them. She had not gone looking for Lornix the second time. He had simply been there. It was the 5th night after the corridor, 2 nights before the ceremony, and she had gone down to the eastern cellars to confirm the passage's exit point one final time, to walk it in the dark without a candle so that her body would know the route by feel and not by sight, because she understood that when the moment came, she would not have the luxury of light. She moved through the lower corridor, through the broken wall panel, into the cold throat of the passage beyond, and when she turned the corner, she had found him sitting in the dark the way he was always sitting in the dark, as though the dark were simply another room, and he had been in it long enough that it had become comfortable. White-furred, enormous, perfectly still. The eyes were the only light, pale amber, the color of old honey, and in them something that had no animal equivalent, an attention too old and too particular for anything as simple as instinct. She sat down across from him without being asked, because she had learned in their first meeting that Lornix did not operate on invitation and did not respond to formality. She set her back against the cold stone and looked at him and said plainly, "Tell me about the territory sickness." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she began to understand the question had been the right one. "It is not a sickness," he said. His voice was low and carried the particular resonance of old stone, the kind of sound that seemed to come from somewhere below the chest. "It is an absence." An absence of what? Of what you carry. She looked at him. He looked back. "The Delk bloodline?" she said slowly, not as a question. The lunar gift does not work the way the alpha believes it works. He said this without judgment, without satisfaction, the way a very old thing states a fact that it had simply been waiting for someone to be ready to hear. He believes it is a fuel, something to be extracted and burned, something that exists in the blood and can be taken from the blood. A pause. It is not in the blood. It is in the living. It requires a breathing soul, a body that moves through the land and touches it and tends it. Your presence in this territory, your hands in the soil of the kennels, your compounds in the water, your feet on the ground, has been slowing the sickness since the 4th day of your arrival. Geraldine sat with this. She thought about the wolves, calmer by the 3rd day. The frost in the lower courtyard that had, she now realized, receded slightly along the paths she walked most often. The particular grayness of the eastern trees that had seemed in the last few days marginally less gray. So marginal that she had decided she was imagining it. "He kills me," she said, and her voice was entirely level, "and he loses the only thing that was actually healing his territory." "He kills you," Lornix agreed, "and the territory dies within a generation. The dark ritual he has been performing, the one he believes prepares the altar for the binding, has been feeding the land's vitality for 3 years. You have been, without knowing it, partially counteracting it." She thought about Xavier's voice through the door. The territory sickness, her blood, the only cure. He believed his own story so completely that he did not think to question its premise. He made the sickness. He made the sickness. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the sovereign healer accord. Something shifted in the old wolf's amber eyes. "You know of it?" "My father mentioned it once, an old law, healer's protection. Older than the keep, older than the Northern Dominion's current form. It was written when the first packs understood that a healer was not a resource to be claimed." He paused. "If an alpha moves to spill the blood of a bonded mate for the purpose of power acquisition, the offer strips him of divine right. It cannot be done secretly. It must be invoked by witnesses on neutral ground at the moment of the attempt." Another pause. "You would need the words, you would need the ground, and you would need to be alive to speak them." She looked at him steadily. "Where are the words?" He told her. She committed them to memory with the same focused, methodical attention she brought to a new compound, repeating them internally until they sat in her mind with the certainty of something she had always known. When she was finished, she looked at him and said, "You have been waiting for someone to give this to. I have been waiting for someone worth giving it to. And it was not flattery, it was simple and complete." She rose from the cold stone floor, brushed the dust from her cloak, and looked down at him and said, "Thank you, Lornix."
He closed his eyes. He was already somewhere else, somewhere old and patient and unhurried. She left him there and went back up through the passage, through the broken panel, through the lower corridor, and by the time she reached her chambers, she had the route memorized in her feet, the words memorized in her chest, and something in her that had been moving quietly, carefully, alone, felt for the first time like it had a shape, like it had weight and edge and direction. One night until the ceremony, she had everything she needed. He came to her door the evening before the blood moon. She heard the knock and knew, before she opened it, what it would be. One final performance, calibrated to keep her placid and compliant through the morning. She had seen it coming for 2 days, in the small gestures that had begun again, a meal left outside her door with a sprig of dried winter flower across the tray, a servant dispatched to ask whether she needed additional blankets, whether the fire was adequate, whether she had everything she required. Small courtesies, careful ones. She opened the door. He was carrying a cup of warmed spiced cider, 2 cups, held with a casualness that was almost convincing. He was in the simpler tunic again, the one without the formal leathers, the one that had made him look like a person rather than a title in the snowy courtyard. She understood now that this was also a choice. Everything was a choice. Everything had always been a choice. "I thought we might sit," he said, "before tomorrow." "Of course," she said.
She stepped back and let him in. She sat across from him at the small table near the hearth and accepted the cup he offered and held it without drinking from it. She looked at him with a clear, level, courteous attention. Nothing more. He talked. She answered. Every response she gave him was precisely correct, appropriately warm, appropriately calm, not so distant as to alarm him, not so present as to be false. She had learned this register long ago, this formal, sharp precision that lived exactly at the edge of graciousness, the kind of manner that made the recipient feel subtly but persistently that something had shifted without being able to name what or when. She watched him try to locate the thing he had lost and could not find. He mentioned the ceremony with the measured confidence of someone who has rehearsed the mention. "The ritual tomorrow is important for the pack," he said. "Symbolic. Old forms. You understand the northern traditions require their ceremonies to be honored." "Of course," she said again. "I understand traditions very well." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. Something in the silver eyes moved, not suspicion, not quite, but the instinctual discomfort of a man who is accustomed to reading rooms and finding this one subtly, inexplicably unreadable. She gave him nothing, not coldness, he would have known what to do with coldness, just precision, just the clean, formal surface of a woman who was entirely present and entirely elsewhere at the same time. He left an hour later. At the door, he paused and looked back at her, and there was something in the look that she might have named differently 3 weeks ago, something that in another life, in a story with different architecture, might have been the beginning of a man noticing what he was about to lose. She closed the door quietly behind him. She did not replay the look. There was nothing to build on it, and she had run out of time for building on things that were not real. She waited 2 hours. Then she began. The binding ceremony was set to the 2nd hour past midnight, under the blood moon at its highest point. Torches were lit along the entire outer wall by the 1st hour, amber fire in long rows against the dark, the smoke rising into air that had gone very cold and very still, the way air goes when the sky is doing something significant. The pack gathered in the outer courtyard and then processed up the stone steps to the grand lunar altar on the upper ridge, a flat expanse of ancient rock that looked out over the northern dominion from the keep's highest point, where the wind came off the mountains in long, clean sweeps, and the blood moon hung directly overhead, enormous and red and old. The altar stone was already prepared. The ritual blade was on it, silver-handled, old, its edge dressed with compounds she recognized from her study of the keep's darker stores, compounds that had no healing function. Xavier stood at the altar's head in full ceremonial leather, the dark cloak moving in the mountain wind, one hand resting on the altar stone. His silver eyes were forward, composed, already past the moment and into what came after it. The pack formed their rows behind him, the torchbearers at the outer edges, the warriors between them. Fexa Darkpelt near the front, her face in the torchlight carrying its usual sharp assurance. Bracknor stood at Xavier's right, slightly back, his face unreadable. The figure in the moss-green hooded cloak came up the processional steps at the 2nd hour, precisely on time. The hood was deep. The cloak was the one Geraldine had worn on arrival, the one the pack would recognize. The figure moved with the measured, quiet pace of a woman who had been trained in graciousness and had learned to wear it like armor. It stopped at the altar's near edge and stood with its head slightly bowed. Xavier reached for her. His hand closed on the hood. He pulled it back. The cloak fell, and what was beneath it was not Geraldine Delk. It was a bundled form of packed wool and shaped cloth, and the silver clasp from her grandmother, the clasp she had pressed into the bundle deliberately, specifically, so that if anyone looked closely they would understand that the absence was not accidental, that it was a message, that it had always been a message. The shattered clay vessel lay at the bundle's feet. The compress she had made on the 12th night, the one with her own essence in it, left where he could see exactly what he had been handed and chosen to destroy. Xavier stared at the empty cloak. The courtyard went so silent that the torches were the loudest thing in it.
Breknor, at Xavier's right, looked at the empty cloak and then looked at the mountain ridge beyond the altar, and his expression did something complicated and brief that was over before anyone else had turned to look. She was already through the tunnel when they pulled the hood back. She had been in the passage for 40 minutes, moving in the dark without light, her feet knowing the route from the 5 nights she had walked it, her pack strapped close, the journal in the interior pocket against her chest. The passage sloped upward through the keep's old foundations, through a section of the outer wall that had been sealed and forgotten, and emerged in a fold of rock on the mountain's eastern face, below the altar ridge, shielded from it by a shelf of stone, but connected to the neutral grounds above by a path that Lornix described to her, and that she confirmed on the 3rd night, without knowing then why she needed to confirm it. She came out of the tunnel into the cold mountain air, and stood for a moment in the dark. The blood moon was above her, directly above, so large and red that it seemed less like a celestial object and more like a wound in the sky. And in its light, everything around her was red-edged and sharp and enormously clear. She could see the pack on the altar ridge above. She could see Xavier at the altar stone and the circle of torches, and the small, still moment of incomprehension when the hood was pulled and the empty cloak revealed itself. She did not wait for the noise to reach her. She began to climb. The neutral grounds were a shelf of flat rock above the altar ridge, 100 feet of exposed mountain face between them, the place where, by law older than the keep and older than Xavier Branham's bloodline, no pack law held jurisdiction and no Alpha's authority extended. She looked it up in the archive the keep kept in the lower library on the 9th day, when she was still cataloging everything and did not yet know why certain things were pulling her attention. She knew now why. She reached the summit of the neutral grounds as the sound of voices from below reached her, the commotion beginning, orders being issued, the particular quality of noise that belongs to a powerful man encountering a thing that has not gone according to his plan. She heard her name called from somewhere below, sharp and controlled. She turned towards the crowd below. She planted her feet on the flat stone at the neutral ground's highest point, and she looked down on it all. The altar ridge, the torches, the assembled pack in their dark cloaks, the warriors with their weapons, Xavier standing at the altar stone with the empty cloak in his hand. She looked at it all, and then she drew a breath of mountain air so cold it felt like drinking from a deep well, and she let it settle in her chest, and she spoke. Her voice was not a shout. She did not need a shout. The mountain carried it, the clean acoustics of open stone and cold air, and a woman who had spent her whole life learning to make herself heard without raising her voice. It reached the courtyard below with a clarity that left no room for mishearing.
By the sovereign healer accord, written in the first binding of the Northern Dominion, I invoke the law of the living bond. Below her, the crowd went still. An alpha who moves to spill the blood of a bonded mate for the acquisition of power forfeits his divine right in the eyes of the land, the pack, and the old law. Let those who stand as witness here bear testimony. Let the land itself bear testimony. She pressed both palms flat to the rock beneath her feet. She had understood, from what Lornix told her, that this was not a gesture of performance. It was the mechanism itself. The lunar bloodline did not work through extraction. It worked through contact, through a living body touching living ground and opening deliberately, consciously, completely, the way a healer opened to a patient she had decided to save. It required intent. It required willingness. It required a choice made not under compulsion, but in complete freedom on neutral ground under an open sky. She felt the land move through her the way a deep current moves through still water, vast and cold and entirely real, rising from the rock through her palms, up through her arms, into the center of her chest where her healer's essence had always lived and where it now expanded with a force that she had spent her whole life unconsciously containing. The ground beneath the keep lit up in her awareness like a map coming into focus. Every root, every water channel, every place the dark ritual had burned and pulled and taken.
She could feel the sickness where it lived, and she could feel, with the same clarity, the specific places where her 32 days of work in this territory had quietly, stubbornly pushed back against it. She did not pour herself into it carelessly. She was a healer. She understood dosage. She understood the difference between flooding and restoring. She gave what the land needed, precisely and intentionally, the way she had always given, not extracted from her against her will, but offered on her own terms, in her own time, from a position of complete authority. Below her, the ground around the altar ridge changed. It was not dramatic. It was not theater. It was the particular, unmistakable quality of a thing returning to what it had always been. The frost along the stone edges receding, the gray in the mortar of the outer wall giving way to something warmer. The wolves in the kennel far below going quiet in the way that creatures go quiet when the thing that has been agitating them stops. The air itself shifted, a single degree towards something living. The pack felt it. She could see it in the way they moved, the small collective stillness, heads lifting, bodies reorienting towards something they did not yet have words for, but that their animal selves recognized completely. She straightened. She took her palms from the rock, and then she looked directly at Xavier Branham and spoke the final words of the accord with the clear, level, unhurried precision of someone who has already done the work and is simply now naming what is true. The bond is broken by the Alpha's intent. The right is forfeit. Let it be witnessed. Let it be held. The silence that followed was the kind that does not precede noise. It was the silence of something being permanently rearranged. Xavier stood at the altar stone. He was still holding the empty cloak. His silver eyes were on her. She could see them from the neutral grounds, clear in the blood moon's light, and in them was something she had never seen there before. Not rage, not calculation, something rawer than either, something that sat beneath the Alpha's architecture and the title's performance and all the cold, careful machinery of a powerful man's ambition. He looked like someone who had just understood the sum. Brackner was the one who spoke first from below. His voice carried no laziness now. It was low and direct and aimed at the warriors nearest him. "Stand down." And then to the pack at large, with the simple authority of a man who has been waiting for a moment to cost him something and has decided the cost is acceptable. The accord has been invoked with witnesses. It stands. Fexa Darkpelt stood very still at the front of the crowd. She looked up at Geraldine on the neutral ground summit with an expression that had shed its sharpness and taken on something more honest. Not warmth, but recognition. The look of someone recalibrating a calculation they thought was complete. Cleor Stormshard, the young warrior whose broken forearm Geraldine had set and compressed on the 6th day, and who had said nothing to her since, but had watched her with a quiet, steady attention that she had noticed and filed. Cleor stepped forward from the warrior rows and turned, not towards Xavier, but to the neutral ground. The gesture was small and unannounced and required nothing. It was simply a body orienting itself to the thing that it had decided was true. 2 others followed, then 3 more. It was not a revolution. It was quieter than that. It was the land's creatures doing what creatures do when the thing that has been wrong stops being wrong. She did not go back into the keep that night. She came down from the neutral grounds by the eastern path, and Brackner met her at the foot of it, alone, without his weapons, his hands at his sides. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the assessing, non-lazy version of him that she had glimpsed through the war chamber door. "I should have come to you sooner," he said. "You came when it mattered. That is sufficient." Something in his face shifted. "Where will you go?" "Home, to my valley." He nodded slowly. Then, "He will not accept this easily. He does not have to accept it. He simply has to live with it. Those are different things." She looked at him steadily. "The territory will continue to heal if it is not interfered with. That requires someone to enforce it from the inside. I will not be that person." Brackner looked at her for a long moment. Then, "I will hold it." She believed him.
not because he was good, and not because she trusted him with the fullness of trust, but because she had watched him carefully for 12 days, and she understood that his fear of Xavier's madness was real, and that fear, properly directed, was sometimes more reliable than loyalty. "Then hold it," she said, "and send word to Lornix if the dark ritual's residue reasserts. He will know how to reach me." She left before the blood moon began to set. The valley was greener by the time she arrived. Not dramatically, she was a healer, and she understood that healing was not theater. But the trees along the lower road had less of that gray exhaustion in their bark, and the river ran with a clarity it had not in 2 years. And when she pressed her palm to the earth at the valley's edge, she felt the Delk bloodline answer back, not pulling, not depleted, but present and reciprocal, alive. She stood there for a long time with both palms flat on the cold ground. Her father was on the porch when she came up the road. He looked older and also somehow lighter, as though something he had been carrying for 2 winters had set itself down. He did not ask her what had happened. He looked at her face and understood, the way he had always understood her, and he held the door open. She went inside. She set down her pack. She washed the mountain cold from her hands in the water basin by the window. She looked out at the valley, her valley, the one she had come from and returned to, and answered to her living presence with the simple fidelity of a thing that was simply biologically true. She was the sovereign healer of the northern boundary. Not by anyone's permission, not by a treaty's provision or an alpha's decree, by the old law invoked on neutral ground under an open sky, by witness and by the land itself, by 32 days of work done quietly and without announcement in a keep that had been dying, and now, because of her continued existence, beginning the long, slow process of not dying anymore. She had no interest in ruling the Northern Dominion. She had no interest in the Great Hall, or the altar stone, or the ceremonial leathers, or any of the architecture of power that Xavier Branham had spent his life constructing. She had interest in this valley, in the soil along the lower terraces, in the river's clarity, in the families who had moved east with their quiet eyes and their loaded carts, and which she would, in time, write to. That was sufficient. That, in fact, was enormous. She heard, later, weeks later, through Brackner's dispatched messenger, that Xavier had not immediately accepted the Accord's ruling, that he had raged at first with the particular fury of a man who had constructed the entire architecture of his future on a premise and discovered the premise was wrong, that he had demanded the ritual be re-performed, had called for the keep's archive to be searched for counter-precedent, had stood at the altar stone in the blood moon's waning light for a long time after everyone else had gone inside, and then, the messenger said, he had gone to the eastern cellars. She did not know what Lornix said to him in the dark. She did not know what the old wolf's amber eyes showed him, or what ancient arithmetic he laid before a powerful man who had thrown away the only heart in the Dominion that would have healed him without being asked. She did not know, and she found that she did not need to know. She had work to do. She knelt in the soil of the lower terrace on a morning 3 weeks after her return, her hands in the cold earth, feeling the valley breathe, and she began again from the beginning, the way healers always begin, the way living things always begin, from the ground up, from the root, from the first careful act of tending something that is still worth tending. The blood moon was past, the sky was clean and pale and entirely hers. She did not look back. If Geraldine's story found something real in you, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're reading from. I want to know how far she has traveled. And if you want to see what happens when a woman who has learned to be still becomes the most dangerous thing in the room,